So our conventional approach to conservation, the Nature Conservancy and many other conservation organizations, is that we find the rare species or whatever we're interested in conserving, and then we protect those places. That approach has been quite successful, but there is one obvious exception where this might not work, and that's if you're dealing with some kind of ephemeral habitats. And I want to talk about an example of that kind of ephemeral habitat, in this case floodplain forests. And this is on the upper Connecticut River in northern New Hampshire. If we imagine this big blue circle as being the area of the Connecticut River watershed, then about 3/4 of that is forested, but only a very small portion of that is floodplains, only about 0.5%, and it's only about 0.1% that's forested floodplain. So floodplain forests are quite rare, and this is why through a regional gap analysis, TNC became interested in doing conservation on them. The previous talk mentioned Arcadia in the East Hampton, just down the Mill River near the campus. This picture was taken there, just illustrating that floodplain forests are forests along the river that flood periodically. And so we started by looking at flooding as the dominant process driving composition of floodplain forests. To study that, we looked at over 100 sites throughout the Connecticut River Basin, from Long Island Sound up to the Canadian border. These 100 and some sites included all the different floodplain forest types that had been described previously by botanists, and most of them were sites that were already known to be good examples of floodplain forests. And then what I focused on was to run vegetation transects perpendicular to the river to study the relationship between flooding and vegetation. To study flooding, the key is to measure elevations, both in the floodplain and in the river. This is going to be fun in late summer. You take elevation data for a transect running perpendicular to the river. Several of them, you can put them into a hydraulic model and then run flows from data from USGS stream gauges across that model to give you the elevations of the water at different flows and calculate a flood history for each point along your transects, for which you can also get the vegetation data. So you can create some nifty maps. Like this is the cover slide was taken of this area here at different stages of flow. So this was something like in the picture that I showed, all the way to places that only flood rarely. And then with the vegetation data and vegetation transects that run across the floodplain, we can do some statistics to look at important transitions in the floodplain vegetation. Herbaceous marsh, which occurs in places that flood over 140 days per year. When you have less flooding than that, you have shrub swamps that occur in places that flood about 95 days per year. And if it floods less than that, you have the floodplain forest dominated by floodplain tree species like silver maple. And at about 4.5 days flooding per year, you get a transition to upland tree species. So I summarized these transitions in a diagram here. You can see transitions both in terms of stage, where this is the stage of the 2-year flood, and different elevations of different types of surfaces. And you can also, down here, with the vertical lines, read off the transition in days per year or percent of days. Look at individual species like silver maple, the dominant of low floodplain forest in places like Arcadia along the Connecticut River main stem. This is importance value, and we see that its dominance really increases with higher amounts of flooding, 20 to 50% of the time, and then decreases where the flooding gets too much for trees. By contrast, sugar maple, which dominates a lot of our upland forests, really is restricted to places that don't flood every year, or if they do, less than 1 day per year. Look at shrubs too. This is the buttonbush that dominates a lot of the shrub swamps. Its importance is greatest where it's too wet for trees. Basically, it's released from competition by trees. And we can also look at invasive shrubs like Japanese barberry, and also see that the flooding tends to eliminate those, mostly restricted to places that flood less than a day per year. So the floodplain forest composition seems to be maintained by flooding, and I've quantified these thresholds in this paper that was published last year. It's a new open source journal, so anybody that's interested can take a look. And it has some useful appendices for where you can look up the data for individual species if you are interested in individual species. So at this point, we know where the great floodplain forest occurrences are that are left. We know how much they need to flood, so we can work with the Army Corps of Engineers to modify their operations at their dams for greater downstream ecological benefit for floodplain forests. And it'd be nice to say, well, job nicely done. We know how to conserve these places now. The only problem is there's one wrinkle in the story, and that's sediment accretion. Whenever a floodplain floods, there are also sediments coming in, and they can come in at quite a large rate. So low floodplain forests and bars can have average rates of 10 centimeters per year of gain in elevation from these sediments. So rather dramatic. And in a big event like Hurricane Irene a few years ago, we measured even 0.5 meter in that single event of sediment coming in. And that is a natural process. We saw, for example, upland species like sugar maple dying the following spring. So they didn't die in the flood, but then because their roots were buried under thick layer of sediment, they died the following year. So it helps keep out the upland species and invasive species. But it also means that in the long term, the amount of flooding is going to decrease on these surfaces. Surfaces that flood frequently and for long durations today aren't going to do that in the future. Eventually they're going to become sufficiently well drained that upland species can invade them. So nature has a solution to that problem, and that's geomorphic change. Channels migrate. This is the Green River, a Connecticut River tributary in Greenfield, Massachusetts. That's in Franklin County, where we had a talk earlier. These are two of my research transects running perpendicular to the river to study the variation of vegetation with topographic variation. So in 2001, it looked like this. Then the aerial photo from 2005 shows a little geomorphic change. Like there's a bar that was created in the river bifurcated there, and some of these bars grew. And then a few years later, the meander bed got cut off. The river is now running here instead of here. There's a bit of an oxbow lake here, and partially filled with sediments, lots of seedlings coming in the year after it got pinched off. And more change since then with this big bar coming in here, and a lot of vegetation growing in here, a lot of tree seedlings on these low surfaces, restarting the succession of floodplain forests. So this lateral channel migration is how these communities are maintained and why they're ephemeral. So I was interested in studying the succession. This is Rainbow Beach in Northampton. It's a point bar in the Connecticut River where the river has been moving in one direction for many years. So it's a good place to do dendrochronology and study succession. So you have the beach with some pioneer species on it. The federally listed endangered Puritan tiger beetle. This is one of the sites, in a few sites in the world where it occurs. then you have some seedlings and pioneer species like willows, followed by successively older forests as you go back from the beach. You do a transect from the beach at 0 further back with bigger numbers on Rainbow Beach. You can describe the vegetation distribution. Same thing here at Maidstone Bends in northern Vermont to compare at different latitudes. So on the beach you have pioneer species like black willow, followed by cottonwoods that remain as emergents for a while, and increasing dominance of silver maple and eventually American elm and ash dominating the forest. The same kind of pattern in the understory, where on the beach you have wildflowers, including some rare ones, followed by wood nettles in the understory of the forest that are increasingly displaced by ostrich fern on the older surfaces. We can confirm those patterns with dendrochronology. So this is the same Rainbow Beach transect where 0 is the beach, and this is increasingly further back from the beach. And we now have a time axis from dates from the age of the trees. Near the beach you have the black willows. The X's here are the cottonwoods that they come in near the beach, but then they persist as emergents. The red triangles are the silver maples that are dominant throughout most of the time. But then on the older surfaces back here, you have the ash and especially the elms coming in to dominate the forest. And unfortunately, because of Dutch elm disease, they die when they're about 1 to 10 inches in diameter, so they no longer take over the canopy. So the succession is probably being altered quite a bit by Dutch elm disease. And in northern Vermont, you have the same pattern of silver maple dominance, eventual ash and elms taking over in the understory. Another way to look at it, my co-author Erik Martin and I, we looked for some historic aerial photos, the oldest ones we could find, ranging from the 1930s to the 1950s, and looked at what was the location of the riverbank in the historic aerial photo and where is the location of the riverbank now, and then measured that as an estimate of the average channel migration rate. And so on an eroding bank, you'd have a negative rate, and on a point bar where you've got the land growing, you've got a positive rate. And if you take a species like black willow, which is a good indicator for these bar habitats, it's not particularly rare, but it's which makes it easier to study. It's common enough to study, but a lot of the rare species like the Puritan tiger beetle are associated with that habitat. So what's striking is that it's really associated with very high rates of lateral channel migration. So these are actually meters, so that's over a meter per year on average. And in some cases even over 10 meters per year on average. And when people see that, they generally see that kind of bank erosion as a problem and try rip-wrapping it and try stopping it. So this may be part of the reason that this habitat has become so rare. Another even more striking way to look at it is to say, what was the land cover in the historic aerial photo in the places where this species occurs now? And in the case of black willow, the places it occurs now were all open water in the historic aerial photo. There was no forest there. Whereas places that were forests that might have had black willow in them, they don't have black willow in them today. So if we just went and protected that black willow habitat where it occurs today, 100 years from now, that habitat wouldn't be there. So what I take away from that in terms of conclusions for conservation, yes, we should protect the existing good examples of floodplain forests that are often threatened by development or clearing for agriculture. But we also need to maintain that flood regime. We need to be aware of upstream watershed changes like increasing pervious surfaces or dam operations. And maybe most important of all is we need to be aware of these geomorphic processes and try to preserve lateral channel migration in the few places that it still occurs. The bank hardening is something that isn't regulated at all. You know, if I were to fill in a wetland in a floodplain, there'd be regulations trying to avoid that or at least mitigate for it. If you try to harden a bank with riprap, there is nothing preventing you from doing that. And part of that is, I think, there isn't enough awareness that erosion can be a good thing. Even conservation organizations sometimes riprap and harden riverbanks, from what I've seen. So I think we need greater awareness of the importance of this to these declining taxa. So thank you for your attention. And
time for questions?
yes, sir.
One thing, the first line of conclusions, threat of development. Doesn't the state have laws on the books to prevent that? And if they don't, the second mitigating factor would be the insurance companies. Who's going to wind up insuring any building on a site that's going to be periodically flooded, even if this only happens once in 10 or even 50 years? A loss is a loss is a loss.
Yeah, so those are all good places to start with conservation strategies. There's the federal flood insurance, which was being reformed last year to try to reduce that kind of development. And there are the regional councils of governments, like Franklin County has one, New Hampshire County has one, are good places to work with the municipalities to try to have bylaws to protect these places. In the back.
Are you able to account for hydrologic manipulation by dams? And the second part of that question would be, would you have any recommendations or suggestions for mitigating conditions to dams that are going to be undergoing relicensing?
So there are 5 dams on the Connecticut River that are up for relicensing. These are major hydropower facilities. And the main hydrologic alteration that they seem to be having is the hydropeaking, which results in some channel incision and erosion downstream. But this hydropeaking is on a diurnal basis, usually at elevations lower than these floodplain communities. So they're a big conservation problem, but I don't think they directly affect the floodplain, at least in the short term. I think a bigger problem are the flood control dams operated by the Army Corps, where they have the ability to control small floods, so they do, even though they're non-threatening. So the spring freshet, they'll hold it back, even though they don't have to. And that, I think, is really a place where there's a lot of room for improvement, where I think we can convince them to let those small floods go that are threatening nothing, but that are really important for maintaining these communities, because it's that annual flooding that's key, rather than the big 100-year flood like Hurricane Irene. Go ahead.
Could you comment on the conflict between agricultural land and floodplains, thinking like the bars and the Deerfield, where there's been a lot of bank hardening?
Yeah, so in New England, unfortunately, the floodplains are one of the few places where we have fertile soils. So the agriculture is really concentrated there, more so than in other parts of the country. And this makes it difficult to find willing landowners for floodplain protection. And also floodplain forests get cleared for agriculture as soon as they accumulated enough sediment that you don't risk losing your crop. So that's a big problem. As far as the bank hardening goes, the farmers usually don't have enough money money to harden the banks a lot. And the Deerfield River, I think that bank hardening is associated with the road, and it's probably the town protecting its road rather than a farmer doing this. Yeah, so the agriculture is obviously a problem for the plants, and that the native plants are being displaced, and for water quality.